Welcome, everybody. You are listening to the Authority Podcast here on the B Podcast Network. Thanks, as always, for being with us. I am pleased to have a returning guest here, Priten Soundar-Shah. He is an educator, philosopher, and entrepreneur working at the intersection of technology and education. Priten is the founder of Pedagogy Ventures, an educational technology company helping teachers navigate the AI age, an Academy for Social Civics, a nonprofit focused on civics education to prepare students for future problems. He develops innovative solutions to help educators and students navigate changes and challenges, especially technological development. Preten was on the show previously to discuss AI and the future of education, teaching in the age of artificial intelligence, and his new book is called Ethical EdTech: How Educators Can Lead on AI and Digital Safety in K-12. That is what we're talking about today. Preten, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Yeah, and I mean, it made me realize I've been doing this for a while, because I think that episode was in 2023, and we've chatted for other series and things in between, but I was referring back to my notes and said, oh man, we're at almost 200 episodes now. I guess we've been doing this a while, but it'll be a good refresher on some of these topics. These technologies have evolved a lot in that time. Would love to start there with, how does this book follow from the first? Was this kind of building on certain elements, right? I think we talked ethics and ethical decision making a little bit there. Was it kind of an expansion of some of that? Was it based on, of course, some of the evolution and change that's happened both in schools and in the technology space? But tell me about, how this kind of follows from what you've been working on over those years.
Yeah. So the way I've been describing it lately is that when I wrote that first book, it started with a lot of optimism. I do think that my first reaction to the development at that point were as a technologist, and I think I was really excited about all of the possibilities that it opened up for some of the problems that I had, been struggling with, and things that I was like, oh, maybe 15 years from now we could do something cool about this, but right now we just have to deal with, the inefficiency or the imperfection. And I think those things all became very doable at that point. And so there was a lot of optimism. I think that I realized very quickly that the community was not feeling as optimistic as I was. And so this was my attempt to bridge my optimism with like what the community was feeling, which was a lot of fear, I think, at that point about assessments in particular, but just in general about what education looked like. I think since then, what I have realized is that while there are lots of possibilities ahead of us, and there were in the last 3 years, and there's a infinite number ahead of us, I don't think we have the resources to pick the right possibilities. And so that was really the moment where I was like, I think there needs to be something more than my first book. The first book was a very technical breakdown of what AI means for education. But I think that there's a missing piece, which is figuring out how do we decide between all of these technical possibilities and the non-technical ones for how we approach education. So that's kind of how that transition really happens. I'm sure as we talk more about it, there'll be anecdotes that come up about like when those things became explicitly clear. But the short story is that I also luckily had a background in philosophy, a background in policy as my academic backgrounds. And so that really did help easily bridge the final piece of this that I think was necessary from just the technical and education aspect, also thinking about this in a more, big picture way.
Yeah. And I know that, this book addresses emerging technologies other than exclusively AI, which we'll get into. But I want to start on the AI for a bit and kind of get to, I guess, from the school's perspective, but I guess from anybody's perspective, kind of like what are the guiding principles of engaging with AI? And I think, like, in other words, why do it at all? Right?
Yeah.
If we have these concerns about ethics, ethical use, and all of that, like, why is it advantageous or even an imperative to engage with it and to grapple with these questions?
Yeah. And that is, I wish we started with that question more. And that is, I think that is the frustration that underlies the book at times, is that I don't think we're stopping to first ask, like, do we even need to be asking this question, or do we need to be even considering this technology? It does become a very this tech tool or not this tech tool, and there's lots of reasons. And predominantly, I think vendor-driven conversations is a huge part of
Mhm.
that. But I think that there's a world in which we can seek out the right solutions to problems that we actually have if we start with where you're starting. And then I think there's a role for a lot of the solutions that are popping up. So I think there's a few things. The first is I think that we have problems in education that tech can solve, right? Or at least help us solve. And so we don't want to be so scared and so pessimistic about this technology that we don't find the solutions that only tech can provide that will solve some of the problems for the children who are in our schools today, right? Like that to me is a moral imperative on its own, that a blanket rejection of the technology that sacrifices something that could benefit a particular student is a miss. And so the easiest example here, I do think, are accessibility tools. Like those can be very useful to real students today that can only be done by technology for now, either because of resource constraints or because of actual tech feasibility. And so, like, if we just say, okay, look, we're not going to even talk about AI because there's ethical problems with it, I think that we're then disservicing those students. And so that's my first thing is I think this is a lot more nuanced than a yes or no blanket question. I think it's about like, can we make sure we're making intentional decisions about when to integrate AI or any ed tech such that it is benefiting real students and not harming other ones. So that's the first part. The second part, and I think this is where a lot of the conversation is driven in the public narrative, is that there is a reality to like we do want our students to be prepared to enter the job market. And as much as folks can sit around and philosophize about other, motivations behind education, which I share, and in fact, I think are more important sometimes than the economic preparation, there is a reality to our economic system requires folks to go to education schools to provide their livelihoods. And that is an assumption we have to operate under when we're thinking about how we build education technology policy, and especially like tech literacy for K-12 and for college. And so again, this is about like making sure we find the minimal ways to make sure that our students are not struggling when they enter the job market or not finding themselves behind in the job market without sacrificing other really important goals that we have for education, whether it be like civic engagement and making sure that they're effective members of our democratic society, or whether it be their own happiness and fulfillment and flourishing. Like we need to make sure that those aren't sacrificed at the cost of economic preparedness, but we also can't just ignore economic preparedness. And so the reality is the job market is, wholeheartedly embracing AI in a lot of different aspects, and our students need to be able to navigate that.
Yeah. And, wrote about, and I'm sure this probably cuts both ways, but some basically the fears about what may transpire in the future, depending upon, I guess, what the education system chose to do when it comes to AI, right? The over usage, over indexing that comes at the expense of the human factors, right? That contribute to hopefully our development as individuals, as kids. I'm sure some on the other side of those potential schools or individual educators, right? Probably more likely who may still at this point, more or less refuse to engage again in then asking the hard questions about what is this, what does it do, what does it not do, what can we anticipate it will do in the future, what do we think students are doing outside of class time, right? How are we best serving them? I think there's been quite a bit of media coverage about some of the worst case scenarios of what that may look like, right? And so even if the answer is we want to have really limited like guided restricted use within the learning environment and we've articulated our policies around that as XYZ, it's we basically can't avoid the fact that these technologies are out there, that it is literacy, digital literacy, media literacy, right? In this day and age, it's the next version of that. And but what were, I guess some of those fears, particularly around, okay, if we go too far with it, maybe if we don't think critically enough, we don't make sound decisions, have clear policies, right? Really understand what's right and wrong, and just kind of go with that over the top over evangelism kind of thing, right? And which, I mean, one, we're still making decisions for kids, right? There is such a thing as age appropriate, as developmentally appropriate, and all of that. But I think the same thing applies to plenty of adults who these are just really quickly evolving, fast changing, hard to understand technologies, right? And it's quite easy to get kind of separated probably from one's own mind in a sense, right? If we're not actively and consistently and constantly thinking through, okay, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? What's it for?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think this is where I think one of the problems that we have is that we are, to some degree, are giving up a lot of our agency within our school systems to the public narrative. And so I think that there's this like immense FOMO, if I'm being like really honest, about like if we don't move quickly enough in our school districts or our universities, that we're going to be behind in some way, that our students will be behind in some way. And I think the pace of the technology doesn't help that pressure, right? Like I think that when there's immediately new developments and you haven't even yet fully figured out how you're going to respond to the earlier ones, you naturally are going to feel like you're behind because in some ways you are. But I think the wrong response here, which I think I'm seeing more and more of, is to use that as a reason to not ask the questions, right? And say,
Mm,
okay, like we just have to keep up. And we see one example and then like, so we're going to follow that example. Or we just need to like try something and then figure this out later. And the reality is that all these things come with lots of risks. Those risks are faced by real students who are developmentally not able to fully consent to everything that we're agreeing for on their behalf. And then I think that the biggest piece of this is that in giving up our agency as like school systems and as individual educators, we're also shortchanging just how many different people are affected by decisions in schools. And this is where I think the philosophical aspects are so important, is that schools don't exist in a vacuum. Schools do not exist just in a capitalist system, right? Like, of course, that is a part of how our schools function in society, but they also serve a lot of other immediate functions, both for local communities and for us as a country. And so when we think about like why we've invested in public education, why we have public university systems, why we have liberal arts schools, and why we don't go immediately to vocational training after high school, like there is a lot of philosophy that undergirds that and has supported that over the years, and that also helps us ask what we're doing in any of these individual situations. But fundamentally, I think that the lack of full conversation with parents, with students, with the local community, I think is one of the bigger problems that we're seeing because of the need for speed. I think that like we don't have enough time to sit down. It just feels like we don't have enough time, rather, to sit down and consult all these different stakeholders whose lives are at stake and whose communities are at stake by the decisions we're making. And so yeah, I do think that a big piece of this is the feeling like we cannot slow down enough to ask really important questions, and there's not a culture of it in education. And that's the second piece of this
mm,
that I think is really important, that I think in reality 2/3 of the book could probably be written in a context that is just about education and not necessarily about education technology, because you have to think about ethics as an independent field, right? Like ethics, we have spent thousands of years of human history thinking about how to approach ethical questions, like what does it mean to be moral. These are not questions that can be just dealt with in a really quick instance. Like there is a vocabulary you have to build and a skill set you have to build to actually think about what is ethical. And there's a reason why there's no one answer that all of human society has agreed upon yet, because it's very complicated.
right.
The second piece of this is that you need to think about what you want out of education. Like you can't ask what is the ethical ed tech decision without first thinking about ethics, then understanding education as a whole, and then approaching the technology. And I think right now we're seeing a lot of let's jump to ethical ed tech as a full concept, but without that scaffolding, I think we're missing so much of the conversation because we don't have the vocabulary or skills right now as a community to approach those questions.
Yeah. I wonder how much of the difficulty basically relates to the the difficulty with which many individuals, much of society has with interrogating ethics, period, right?
Yeah.
Not with respect to ed tech, AI, technology, et cetera, but just ethical conversations, conversations that necessitate nuance, compromise, weighing various options, coming to conclusions. I mean, I don't. in the public sphere, for example, with respect to these technologies, as you kind of mentioned, the need for speed, right? I don't see a lot of perspectives that are ever shared anywhere between it's all dumb and useless and stupid and nobody should ever use it, and I use it for everything. You should do, and so like this, it kind of relates to one of the things in over the past couple of years in a lot of the guidance that I've seen or contributed to provided to schools around it is number one, like you need to have a policy as a district, as a school. It needs to be clearly articulated. It needs to be unique to, what the policy is. That's up to you to consider what's best for you, your students, your educators. But you have to have one because if you don't have one, then you can't really, I mean, how can you fairly and adequately police what's cheating, what's not cheating? How can you give education and guidance and literacy on how to use tools productively? How can give teachers clarity around what is their responsibility for engaging with tools? What is their, their freedom and autonomy to feel like they can introduce things in their classroom and they're not running afoul of district policies, right? All of those and so there is no one right answer. If there's, a school somewhere that determined, I guess, something on one extreme end or the other, but it needs to be clear, consistent, communicated. Training needs to align with that, right? All of those kind of things. But so much of it to me is just kind of falling in the as a society, are we practiced and comfortable with engaging in conversations about ethics, period? And much of that is complicated by the just the state of the world, right? And
Yeah,
then everything is complicated, and there's always not, you can never make a perfect decision, but it really does require grappling with that and then applying some ethical framework to the matter at hand. But first we have to, I mean, ethical is the first word in the title, right? It's the thing that we really need to be willing to consider.
that's right. And I think that you're right that I think that part of this is that I don't think we as a society have built the skills to have conversations on ethics, period. And I think that there's is politicized, right? I think sometimes it's hard to separate out ethics and politics in the public discourse. And I think this is why I draw from frameworks in the book that are not dependent on like universal maxims of truth, because I think that is really important for two reasons. First is that this is all, at the end of the day, these are each individually functioning democratic systems, right? Like this is not about like how should we make top down national policy on like ethical decisions on education technology. It really is how do we make sure that our individual educators are empowered to think about this the way that is ethical but also applicable to their own classroom. And I think that those are very different and they require very different solutions. The second is that I think that there are fields who have similar situations like like education that have been able to build a practice of ethics. And so I think while you and I are not going to solve the general problem of the lack of ethical conversations, I do think there is something that we can do about ethical conversations in education. And the precedent that I draw upon, the connection that Professor Levinson, who's now at Stanford Graduate School of Education, has made, which is that bioethics as a field for medicine did not exist until the 70s and 80s, when like new technologies are exploding and there became a lot of questions about research ethics in particular, because some things were starting to happen that we realized we didn't have the safeguards in place to avoid massive harm to communities. And over the last 40 years, medicine has managed to create a practice of ethics, right? Like most hospitals have an ethics committee, have an ethics officer. Hospital medical schools require ethics courses for their, all of their trainees. And so they have been able to go from not having a system for their field at all to now having a very robust system for how do you deal with all sorts of ethical questions about consent, about allocation of resources, all of which are really context dependent. And so education in that way is very similar to medicine. And that is why I do borrow from how bioethics approaches frameworks for ethical decision making in medicine, because, we also make really important decisions about a really vulnerable population that
Mhm.
depends on a lot of context, including does the actual recipient agree or not? Who else should get a say in the conversation? Do we have the resources? What does this mean for the allocation of our resources? Those are all questions that medicine deals with, and that's why bioethics courses are not here's the right answer in every single situation you'll face out in the wild. It's here's how you should think about these and what questions you should ask and whom you should consult, and that's what we need for education because like you said earlier, there is no like you and I can't sit here and judge the right decision for a school out, outside of our context because we don't know the full context. We won't know the
Mhm.
exact students in the classroom. We don't know what resources the school has. We don't know what the community needs are, and all that only the individual actors on the ground know. And so it's about empowering them to like ask the right questions and have the systems in place to think ethically. And I think that we can, because we're not assuming that there's no prescription in the book. You will not know how I feel about any policy issue that happens to come up, besides that we need to think about the policy issues after you read the book. But that's because the ideal is that like these are community driven ethical conversations that everybody in the actual community feels empowered to participate in, but is consulted on. And I think that that's something that is a much easier task. I know that was a lot, but the last thing I'll say is, there is an assumption that philosophy has to be armchair, and I think there's an assumption that philosophy means it's a lot of time and that it's unrealistic. There's an idealism to it, and I think I've tried really hard to avoid that. And so I think this is why drawing from practical ethics is very different than drawing from larger moral questions of what is good and what is right or how we ought to weigh particular things. Because at the end of the day, it's more about stakeholder consensus and making sure that the stakeholder consensus is informed than it is about like again prescribing some universal truth. And so I am optimistic that there's a short on ramp to be able to have conversations tomorrow and not say, oh, these are conversations that have to happen in the academy that will influence policy in 50 years or 100 years. I really do think we can skip some of those steps because of the urgency of some of the questions.
Mhm. Are there certain, I guess, factors, variables, whatever you want to call, around which I guess, like, developing the critical judgment and like the questions that we're asking are seeming like the most challenging right now, whether it's around data use or opportunity cost or privacy, security? Like, are there certain ones I mean, they all have their own challenges, but that are feeling the most challenging or the hardest to even, maybe pin down what is the question to ask?
Yeah. And I think a lot of the conversation it ends up being about data and privacy and security. And I think that is important. Like the harms that are possible if we are not vigilant about those questions are really high. But in some ways, those are also the easiest ones for us to sometimes police. And there's a couple of reasons. We have more legislation that actually, sets at least some baseline requirements for how education technology operates that provides some security and safeguards for our schools. And then I think that there's a history of state legislation on this and school policies that have a vetting process in place for vendors to make sure that they adhere to some sort of norms about data privacy and
Hmm.
security. Those probably need to be updated with whether or not they train models, right? Like there's all sorts of new questions that AI brings up, but it really is about updating those existing policies. The questions that I think we're having the hardest time asking, and I think we'll have the hardest time continuing to solve, are the ones that make us think about what we want for our students. And that's hard because that requires us to agree on that, which is it's not an easy thing to ask even like five educators in a room to come to a consensus on it. But in because it's so hard, I think we largely avoid those questions, and that's why I think we've given up some of our agency. So when you think about a very easy example for this is like you have an AI tutor, you have the evidence that it's effective at increasing math literacy, you have all the like data and security safeguards in place, and you have enough evidence that like it produces evidence-backed results in contexts like your school. Face value, great. That checks off a lot of basic requirements. I'm like simplifying the conversation right now, but like that does check off a lot of our biggest ethical concerns that often come up. So we might say, let's go ahead and implement the technology tomorrow. But if it comes at the cost, maybe, of our students' relationships with each other, we don't really have the resources to weigh like what is the value of our students' relationships with each other against the the mathematical literacy gains. And those are the conversations that I think we're going to have to ask because of how dramatic of a shift AI is both for society, but also in terms of the capabilities of the tools that we can introduce. And so while in the past, the purpose of education was still, more a part of the conversation that the schools themselves had in terms of curricula setting and pedagogical strategy. And even then, like there has been a narrowing of that because of technology. Right now, because we're not comfortable having the conversation, we're letting other people have that conversation, and that's the problem.
Yeah. So speaking of the people having the conversation, so one of the blurbs quotes on your book from Anand Rao who is a director of the Center of AI and the Liberal Arts at University of Mary Washington. He says most EdTech books tell you what to adopt. This one teaches you how to decide, and we've talked about that. And who should be in the room when you do, right? So let's talk more about that. Who should be in the room? Who are the stakeholders, stakeholder voices, and how do we get them in the room?
Yeah. This is another one that I think this is challenging. Like I don't pretend that these are going to be easy answers or questions. But I think one of the unique things about education is that we simultaneously serve multiple different stakeholders at once. Like every action we take in education is not towards one person, it is not towards one patient, it is not towards one client. It is often towards a classroom full of students. And so we cannot just maximize what is the right thing for one particular student. We also have to consider what that means for the rest of the students. But also, there's a larger part to this because at the end of the day, schools are not the only ones making decisions about students. The parents also have a say. We, as a democratic society, have decided that parents have the ultimate, or oftentimes the ultimate, arbiter of what is right for their children. And so we have to account for the parents. We have to account for the students. The community also matters because when you think about the reason that we fund public education at all levels is because how educated your peers are makes a difference in terms of how healthy society is, right? Like we don't want to be, voting next to people who are not educated, and that is a
Mhm.
fundamental reason why we have built public education systems. But also, we want people to support our economy and be in the workforce, right? Like those are all real needs that, as a community, we have that aren't necessarily an individual stakeholder that can be identified, but rather a more amorphous stakeholder that is also a really important reason why that gets affected by decisions we make in education. The most important one oftentimes is the educator. And this is the one that I think I'm hoping that we can empower more in these conversations, especially as we realize how quickly moving things are, because they will have the most agility to respond to a lot of these changes. And so, like, of those stakeholders, oftentimes none of them are in the room when decisions are made. It is
Right.
oftentimes very top down, whether national, state, or district policy, oftentimes. And even school level policies, it's a hit or miss across the country. Then that's just the reality of how decisions are currently made in education. And we have good reasons for that. I think that there is some level of like urgency that is easier when you have less people in the room making the decision. But again, when you're asking about what is right for education, you have to think about like who is it right for and what do they think, right? Like that we don't pretend to be paternalistic. Like our society is not built on those norms, nor our education systems. And I think there's performative things that we sometimes do, and so sometimes there's student task forces, and we send out parent surveys. But at the end of the day, most of the time, the reality is that inside the actual room where the decision is made, those task forces and those surveys were performative. They were, the decision was either already preemptively made, everybody already had their opinion in that room, and that was kind of done as a checklist item of like, okay, yes, like we got public comment on this, and now we can move on to actually make the decision. And that's where I think like even when we have the people in the room, we can do a better job of making sure we're actually sharing some of that decision making.
Yeah, yeah, it's again another area in which the answer is both, right? Where there's these a lot of times it feels like it's a debate about who should make decisions, right? Educators versus legislators versus, private industry. It's and the reality is all of them have perspectives that account for something that the others don't, but there really are critical on the ground perspectives that educators have and current, not former educators, right? The ones who are in the schools today, that there's always that at least 10% at the very least that is never accounted for in a lot of these conversations, especially just around conversations generally about technology in schools, right? That I find so many times that the viewpoints on it can often even get like 90% of the way there and then make a totally wrong decision because there's a misunderstanding of cause and effect or why things are done or what are the real realities around resource constraints and equity and access and right all the various reasons why technology is a necessity, in addition to areas in which you can have, true high impact evidence-based tools that help to achieve student outcomes that otherwise wouldn't be achieved. But also, like, there's, okay, in this school, half of the classrooms are staffed by a non-certified educator, right? So what do we do about those kids? Or over here, we can't provide a course or a curriculum that our students need because we don't have, there's not enough interest, there's not enough, faculty, whatever, right? All these various things, or we just literally don't have the resources to do all the things, and or student to teacher ratios are what they are, or there's not enough time in the year, there's X amount of time spent on assessment and testing, like all these various factors, right? That even even those who have been in the classroom at some point, one, they everybody does this. We over apply our own individual experience. And that was what, and also, what's the statute of limitations on having been in the classroom, right? I mean, if it's
Yeah.
been 3 to 5 years, ultimately, we can't over apply that. But especially when it comes to, legislators and folks who have not had that role and who do have an important perspective and considerations to take into play, right? That the inclusiveness of those different perspectives of students themselves, of families, right? One, to prioritize clear, consistent, and proactive communication. I mean, it's good to build that muscle in the schools to say, okay, well, there's a lot of things that parents have questions about or misperceptions about because you didn't communicate to them about what's happening, right? So they feel
Right.
they have an information gap. It's not because they don't understand or they don't trust you, like, intrinsically. It's because
Yeah.
there's no explanation. They're not really understanding what's happening or what's going on. All these things around, yes, students and consent and what might they decide and not want to decide, or what's useful for them, or exactly to your point about who are we surrounded by, that a big part of the student experience is not just what they individually have access to and what they put into it and their work ethic, but what are my peers doing, right? And if I might be a great student with a great teacher, but if there's 25 kids in the class and 15 of them are disruptive, or or not engaged with the curriculum, or not following policies or guidelines, that could be detracting from my experience, even if I'm doing all the right things. And anyway, very long spiel here, but I guess all down to each of those stakeholder parties is going to have a perspective that the others won't, and only by having them all engaged. And then when we get to the actual, how do we take things from the federal, state, district to the local level and have consistent execution, implementation, right? Every classroom in every school across the district here is operating according to the same guidelines, so that we know that all students are being given those opportunities. It's just going to happen much more effectively if folks are actively engaged and have a voice in that and are co-creating what that looks like, right? Versus it just being, okay, here it is, everybody do it.
Right. And I think you said trust, and I think that's one of the most important parts of this, because I think there's there's lots of policies that I might see on paper and say, oh, like this to me seems logical given the school's context and how they've reasoned through it. But at the end of the day, that doesn't matter. Like me agreeing with the policy makes zero difference in the actual effectiveness of it. And I think that this is where like the lack of actually consulting with the stakeholders, but also to some degree, like you are going to disappoint some people. Like the assumption is not that a consensus will always be built where everybody agrees, but there is a world in which we can consult everybody, and then they can actually justify to them why you have decided to sidestep that. And that sounds a lot more of like a larger ask than it is, because it often is a very narrow set of concerns that you are having to address. So it's not like if you have 500 parents, you're going to get 500 different, explicitly different themes that are coming up about like why they're concerned about a decision that you're making. it might come down to 3 or 4. And if you address all of those and explain why you're either mitigating their concerns or you've decided that this other thing is more important for the students, that will build a level of trust that will avoid a lot of problems going forward. And I think that's true of students as well. Like if we expect our students to be motivated, engaged, and show up to school and not push back and constantly fight our policies and not constantly rebel, like they need to feel like they can trust us and the decisions we're making in education so that we also get their buy-in. Because without parent buy-in and without student buy-in, and like in an optimistic world, assuming educator buy-in because they were consulted somehow, we're like all of our policies are kind of just like sitting in a room, even no matter how perfectly, an expert might tell you the policy is. And so I think that until we build that system of trust, we will be struggling to make, effective change in education. There's also just like there's a black box effect that we currently have. And everybody's talking about the black box in AI, but like there's a black box in decision making in education. The number of like policies that you see that there's no clear justification for each thing to the public is really high. The number of contracts that are redacted or blacked out or not shared with the board or the parents or the teachers like is really high. Like there's a lot of accountability that we ought to have given how much of a role schools play in how many different people's lives, that I just don't think we're meeting that bar right now. And those are all really easy things. Like these are not complicated asks. There are some things that I think as a philosopher I would want in our school systems that are massive asks. And I think I'm realistic about what can actually be done for the next school year. And some of these things can be done for the next school year. Like actually having a system where you're listening to concerns and addressing them and explaining why you have decided that those concerns are not how your school is going to make a decision. That's very doable for your like next school year policy. Like ensuring that you're actually, making as available as much public information as you can, very doable. Like yes, of course there's HR regulations and there's like personnel policies and student like, but it is way beyond that we currently do not share, right? It is not just when there's personnel questions or student privacy rights. Like there's a lot of the decision making that is completely hidden from all the people who have to not only like be the recipient of those decisions but also sometimes implement them. And so
Mhm.
when we say like, oh, like educators are not like using these AI tools, or they're not actually like making the most of these tools that we paid all this money for, it's because like they don't feel like they have any pain in it. There's no right, like if there's no actual ownership of the strategy and the policy, I think expecting folks to completely follow through with that, I think is short-sighted. And I think we're already seeing some of that start to backfire.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's important what you reference about whether they agree or not, or or think you agree. That that's not what's actually important. I mean, it really is about it's the power of the modeling and how do you show the people in your organizations how to make better decisions in their role and things that are going to create more impact towards an objective. It is to explain the decision making process and the rationale behind why we chose a certain tool, a certain policy, right? And even if ultimately I say, okay, I may have made a different decision, right? I understand why do we do it? What objectives are we aiming toward? What results are we trying to create? And then in my role, I can make decisions that hopefully align to that, right? And I'm going to have whether or not, I guess, organizations, school districts create an environment in which teachers feel that they have autonomy. The reality is, like, they have a lot, right? But, are they using it productively? Are they using it to create a stronger organization that is for the benefit of all students, right? And are they feeling like they're able to apply their knowledge and skills and expertise toward it? Or are they not? But ultimately, like they're in the room with the closed door most of the time. There's a lot of micro decisions within that, right? About how much do I attempt to leverage this, certain resource, right? That's what we were given, or how much do I kind of deprioritize that, or am I focusing on this or that? I mean, there's all of these little decisions that are made about how time and attention, focus are applied. If I understand the bigger goals, then I can also then articulate that better to students and help them understand why are we doing this, why are we not doing it. Correspondence with parents, we reference that, right? Super important. That I mean, that's got to be one of the biggest factors that it would, create high levels of stress and dissatisfaction in the role is I'm always left out to dry with the parents. and like the school isn't communicating anything, like the organization, and so I'm the one that's constantly fielding all the questions at the classroom level about decisions I didn't make. And I'm getting asked all these things about what's this assessment? Is this going on the permanent record? What's going on? All these kind of things. And I don't necessarily know what to say. I didn't choose it. And I don't know if I agree or disagree because I don't even know what we're doing. So just, how much better can everyone be in their role, and how much do they feel that they have autonomy and the ability to exercise their expertise, even though they're not making the macro decisions on some of those things, but I understand why it's done. I know that there at least is purposeful decision making behind it. I know that it's articulated in terms of student learning, student outcomes, right? And if it's not, then it is probably a bad policy, right? These are the things the organizations need to think about. But if I can see, okay, they determine this because they feel this is going to be the best thing, for students. Again, I might say, I'm not sure, but okay, I get that, and now I know in my classroom. All right, I know kind of some of the little things I want to try that's going to work toward that.
Yeah, and I think this was a thought early on in the book writing process for me as well, because the book intentionally is about how educators can lead on AI and digital safety, and by that I do mean classroom teachers. And there was a moment of reflection about whether the book would be better targeted towards school leaders and policymakers. And I think that the part that you said was my internal dialogue, which is that even if we have not fully given all the autonomy that you and I think that we should to classroom teachers, there's a lot of micro decisions that are actually made by educators on a daily basis that have massive ethical implications. And at the end of the day, like they are the ones who are carrying out all the policies. And like I have the earliest memory of being very aware of that disconnect is probably from middle school, where we were like there was an essential questions, like that was the rage for some reason in our district for a little bit. And I remember the number of teachers who would only put up the essential question when they saw like a principal or assistant principal walking through the classroom, roll their eyes, put it up. One teacher always had the same one every day. Like as students, we were aware of which policies that like were top down, that were being followed, that like the teacher found silly, right? Because there's no buy-in on that. If they don't think that's their pedagogical strategy and it doesn't fit their lesson today, like they ought to have the autonomy to not write a single question, like write a particular question on the board. We often don't give that. But at the end of the day, that we do, teachers do like, subvert that oftentimes. And I think that that's good. Like, I think they should not have to subvert something. And ideally, in a world, like they would have the autonomy to make those decisions. But they do already make a lot of those micro decisions on a daily basis, both about like which policies are followed with full, enthusiasm, which ones are begrudgingly followed, and which ones you kind of try to find the loopholes around. I think that educators do that the same way students do. And I think that's because we try to overtly paternalize our classrooms. And so at the end of the day, like there's a lot that, again, even educators in a very top down school district, state, country can still make the decisions that they still make on a daily basis can still have massive ethical impacts. And that's why I think building the ethical fluency is so important right now, because a lot of the work right now is on building tech literacy. And I think that is very important. I don't think that we have reached the levels of tech literacy that we ought to, given how much technology is playing, given how large of a role technology is playing, not just in our schools, but also in society. And so we ought to keep empowering our educators and students to build tech literacy. But when it comes to decision making, that's only at one half of the puzzle. You really need to not just think about like, oh, how does this work, but like whether or not it is good for what I want, right? Like whether or not I should use it is very different than how can I use it. And I think that this is again where like we're seeing a bunch of money invested in PD, and the big tech companies are going in and teaching folks how to use particular tools, but the follow through is not the same. Like we're not seeing the amount of like tech usage that I think people were predicting, because oftentimes teachers are still worried about the risks, they still have concerns, those are not addressed, they don't know how to communicate their choices to parents. Like none of that literacy is built up to think about the other dimensions of AI and EdTech in general, because we are single-handedly focused, myopically focused rather, on just building the tech literacy. And I think that's only one pillar of it.
Yeah. So, listeners, you can get the book Ethical EdTech from Wiley or wherever you get your books. You can go to ethicaledtech.org to learn more. You can go to Preten's website, Preten.org, to learn more about his work. Anything else folks should check out? Anywhere else they should learn more?
I just recommend they check out ethicaleduc.org because I've been posting lots of free resources on there. And as the book comes out, there's a lot more being put out, discussion guides, case studies, classroom policy templates, all sorts of things, and interviews with all of the real educators and students that informed the book as well.
Excellent. Well, folks, check all that out. We'll put those links below in the show notes so you can find all of those resources, learn about the book and those interviews. And if you've not already, please do subscribe to The Authority. We have more interviews like this coming your way every week. Or if you are subscribed and you're enjoying the show, we really do appreciate those 5-star reviews on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. They help other listeners like you find the show and get these episodes themselves. Or if you're looking for more shows, go to bpodcastnetwork.com, and we have dozens of podcasts and education, many more things there to check out. So please do check all of that out. Preeton, thanks again for being here.
Thank you for having me again.